everybody, it's Meredith from BespokeClassroom.com and Bespoke ELA over on Teachers Pay Teachers, and this is another product preview. Today's product preview is a nonfiction unit over the strange case of Lizzie Borden. So we all know that nonfiction is a skill that is necessary for us to address in our secondary ELA classes. However, that may not always be so easy to do, especially when trying to find topics that interest our students and will keep them engaged all the way through practicing the skills they need to practice. But one of the topics that is sure to captivate their interest is the topic of crime and the topic of criminals and the topic of famous criminal cases, famous trials, famous, in this case, accused murderers or murderesses. And Lizzie Borden fits that bill all the way through and through. So Lizzie Borden was a woman living in the late 1800s, Massachusetts. She came from a wealthy family. Her father was the president of a bank. He, by today's standards, would be considered a millionaire. However, he was also known as a miser, very frugal with his money. They did not live in the nicest part of town. They did not live in a big mansion. They didn't have running water. They didn't have electricity. They didn't have any sort of basic things in life that you would presume and assume that a wealthy family would have. In fact, Lizzie became a shoplifter, and that was an issue for her and for her family, and her father would just pay the bills for the things that she stole. I guess it was her way of sort of getting what she wanted. I don't really know, but anyhow, she lived in the house with her father and her stepmother and her sister and a housemaid. And as it turns out, unfortunately, Lizzie's father and stepmother were found murdered. They were hacked to death with an axe or a hatchet, and Lizzie was ultimately accused of the crime, charged with the crime, put on trial for the crime, but acquitted for the crime. When you go back and look at the newspaper stories, though, and see this drama unfolding in Massachusetts in the 1890s, it is captivating, it is fascinating, and the media at that time does not read like it does today. Full of bias, full of very strong tone, not very objective, and it's really interesting study for students to go back, look at those original documents, read and decipher them for tone, look at the structure of how those news articles are laid out, and then practice those skills of reading nonfiction and analyzing nonfiction in a really interesting case. So what you'll find in this project is a series of 10 news articles that all depict the events of this trial, this infamous trial. And what students are going to do is they're going to go through each of the news articles, and they're going to complete this news story analysis guide. So what they're going to do is they're going to look at the text features. So all of these newspaper articles have headlines and subtitles and that kind of a thing. They also have, interestingly enough, these news stories are not written like they are today. They have a lot of bias and tone in them. So they're going to be looking for that, not an objective tone either. They have like really strong opinionated tones. And what's interesting is that the first articles that depict the trial are really against Lizzie Borden, and then as they go on further into the trial, the tide turns and public favor shifts to be in favor of her and against the prosecution. So you see that change in the tone of these articles. They're going to be creating an evidence log wherein they're going to be cataloging every piece of evidence they come across, because they need to decide for themselves whether or not they think Lizzie is innocent or guilty, because after they go through the articles, they will have a debate and they will decide upon a verdict, and they will ultimately be writing their own closing argument speech as a part of this project. But for each of the individual newspaper articles, students are going to answer 5 multiple choice questions. And these questions are simply for preparing students for standardized test prep situations using Common Core question stems and assessing skills such as tone and language and vocabulary and context, and rhetorical devices and literary devices and inference, context clues, all those kinds of skills will be assessed in these multiple choice questions. And one of the things to bring into this conversation is this role of gender and how gender worked against her and maybe ultimately worked for her favor, because in this period in history, women were not allowed to serve on juries. No big surprise. They weren't even really allowed to work still in the late 1800s. And so she was found not guilty by a panel of men from the middle and the upper classes whose wives would have been in the same circles as Lizzie Borden, and certainly would never have thought it possible for a woman to have committed such a barbaric crime. So it worked against her, and maybe it even worked ultimately for her. But discussing how these news stories comment upon gender and what it means to be a woman, and how a woman is supposed to behave, and how a woman is supposed to have emotions, and how a woman, a normal woman would have reacted to these situations, it is a big part of the story. So you can find the Lizzie Borden infamous murder case nonfiction unit over on the Bespoke ELA Teachers Pay Teachers shop. So get over there and check it out. I think your students will really be engaged by this particular project and find it interesting. Thanks for tuning in today, and head on over to Teachers Pay Teachers to find the Lizzie Borden Nonfiction Project unit. And I will see you guys right back here on YouTube later.